Money Sense, bringing an informed financial perspective to the Cayman community.
A very good morning and warm welcome to Money Sense. Today's show is going to discuss a few meaty subjects. We're going to discuss why we are where we are in the world today, why things seem to have got a little bit peculiar, and we're going to touch on that dreaded word Brexit as well. Thus joining me, Simon Caudry, in the studio this morning is my co-host Amy Hubble.
Good morning.
Good morning. And my other co-host, Emil Kalinowski. Good morning.
Pleasure to see you both.
Yes, I was a little late into the studio this morning. Thank you for subtly putting that way, Emil. So we're going to start by, I'm going to start by asking the question, why does the world seem so unhappy? And that might seem a somewhat philosophical question in a sense, but when you look at the data and the numbers, in purely economic terms, we seem to be living in a Renaissance era almost. We have record low levels of employment, record low levels of unemployment, ever-rising standards of living, relative global peace. There aren't that many global conflicts, wars and such like happening, and generally speaking, rising living standards if you look at the statistics. So, Emil, why on earth do we say that the world seems so unhappy against that statistical backdrop?
I agree with you. We are living in fantastic times. This is probably the best moment in human history from a livability point of view. And stock markets are near all-time highs. The U.S. stock market's only 7% off its peak. The Euronext 100, only 3%. The FTSE 100 is only 6% off its highs. Like you said, the unemployment rates are at all-time lows or multi-decade lows all around the world. The OECD puts out a harmonized unemployment rate, and they do it for all the countries that they track. And you will not find a country that is doing poorly in that OECD group. The U.S., going back to 1969, they're at lowest unemployment rates.
In fact,
Canada, 78, and so on.
And just to interrupt you on that one, because during, well, I guess you call it the Obama era, there was a lot of talk about how unemployment was low, but the commentators will say, well, that's not really the unemployment level you should be looking at, because there's been some statistical nefarious activity, and actually there's different calculations of these things. But when you add in all those things that people say were misguidedly excluded, you add all those people who are disenfranchised from looking for jobs, who can't be bothered to look for jobs because there isn't the incentive to do so. Even including all those people, unemployment levels are still at extraordinary low levels. So it still confuses me even more, perhaps.
I believe in the United States the labor force participation rate, if you add in, is quite low. It's at a rate that we last saw in the late 1970s. So in the United States, there is a problem of labor force participation that works out to between 5 and 8% of the total population or the working age population. And if you added that to the 3%, 4% unemployment rate, we would get to 10, 11% people who would like jobs but don't have them. And that's not wonderful. But in other countries, the labor force participation rate does not have that problem, and it's doing very well. Nevertheless, as you said, the world is unhappy because everything that I just mentioned is simply not enough. It sounds good, but humans desire more. And the problem is that ever since 2007, 2008, the world has fallen into a period of economic growth, but at just moving along at very low levels, not economic growth as we understood it. For example, in Britain, household disposable income, so how much the household individual is earning. Before the crisis, so the 11 years before the crisis, it was growing at 3% a year. After the crisis, it's only growing at 1.2% a year. And that 1.8% difference over 11 years is a very big number. And I know what you're saying. You're saying that's only 11 years. You're probably cherry-picking the best years. But if we broaden it out, if we go back to...
Emil brought his stats book today, didn't he?
I always have it
For a
with me.
second there, my heart was warmed that you were only going to talk about good things.
I'm sorry, Amy. If we go back even further to 1945 through 2007, 1945 through 2007, everything happened during that period. Everything good, everything bad. The average real GDP per capita, so how much is the economy growing per person in this country? Let's talk about the United Kingdom. It was a little bit over 2% from 1945 to 2007. That's a 63-year average. That's what you're expecting. Since 2008, from 2008 to 2018, it is at 0.5%. And that is what I believe is the problem. You brought up Brexit earlier, but if we broaden this discussion to the whole world practically, you have a similar phenomenon take place in Australia, Brazil, Canada, Germany, Spain, France, Italy, Japan, Mexico, Turkey, the United States. There's simply not enough growth. There's growth, not enough. People are upset.
Well, let me try and address this question in perhaps a different way. So your postulation is that there's not enough growth and therefore people are disappointed by that. But there was also, and it's completely gone off the tip of my tongue as to what his name was, French economist Thomas Piketty, is it?
Piketty,
thank you. He wrote a very well-regarded, well-read, widely read, I should say, widely read book about inequality. And lack of growth is different to how growth is shared. How would you address that particular subject? Or Amy, if you have any comments on that as well. Is it a lack of growth that really is the problem? Because if I look at it and say, well, if I had 10 years of 2% growth or 5 years of 4% followed by a recession, I think I'd prefer 10 years of 2 because it's more stable, it's more regular. It seems you get to the same output.
But it's not 2%. It's much less than that.
Understood. But I'm simplifying it for my own mathematical skills. Whereas what his argument was is that 2% in my numbers has actually been shared unequally, and it's been shared increasingly unequally, if that's not a mixed set of words. So how do you address that particular problem?
I would agree with you. I think that's part of the problem. But I would say the underlying issue is economic growth. You would be okay if you felt that economic opportunity lay ahead for you and your family. And you would not be too upset about the fact that someone else is perhaps making more and faster. And that's what we saw during the 1990s and 2000s. Economic inequality was expanding, but everyone was having a share of the growing pie. Since 2008, the pie has not been growing very fast, and now we're fighting over those scraps. We're talking about how we're going to divvy up the pie. So I think yes, it's a problem, but more important is the lack of overall growth.
You're worried about the size of the pie. Okay, fair enough. And populism then, that's I guess symptom, is that the right word to describe it? A symptom of this problem that you're addressing is the rise of populism, which implies, I guess if you define the word correctly, it defines politicians doing what the population would like them to do, even if it may not necessarily be in their best interest. It's not leadership, it's following, and it's following gang-type rule as opposed to sensible ideas and sensible strategies. The rise of populism obviously is manifested every single day on our TV screens when we look at the US, and I'm looking here at the US people around the table. How do you address, what's your perspective, Amy, then on why populism has become such a prominent and forceful power in our communities of late?
Yeah, I'm not sure, and I'm also not sure that both the political sentiment that exists in the U.S. exactly matches what we're seeing in Europe, or kind of what has driven that. But I want to kind of steer away from this broad idea that especially people that voted for Trump or people that live in Middle America, which I am from, as is Emil, are just naive and stupid. They are certainly sheltered. They do not have a lot of exposure to people that are different than them, one. But on that same token, they do not spend a lot of time thinking about global economics or really the impact on anything that does not directly affect them. And so I think that we do see some obviously very polar political parties right now in the U.S. And that, I think, is what is a little bit confusing to me, because when I'm in the U.S. and I'm talking to people, I don't necessarily feel this political unrest or this civil unrest or this unhappiness level. And I'm not sure what necessarily is happening throughout the rest of the U.S., but in Oklahoma, where I'm from, the majority of people who did vote for Trump did so based on social issues. But, and disclaimer, I believe Trump to be a vile and terrible person and do not support the way or manner in which he goes about any of his policies or his day-to-day living at all. But life has been pretty good under Trump for Americans. We do have 3.7 unemployment, although albeit less underemployment. We do have averaged, from a financial side, about 14% return in the stock market for the last 3 years. And we have lower taxes and low inflation. Housing market's good, and we can get loans pretty well. So life is not terrible in the U.S. just for the average person. And so from that standpoint, I'm a little bit afraid that he will get reelected.
I'd like to go back to what Simon said a little bit earlier when you said electing individuals who are not suggesting sensible policies. That was an important point that you made. And I'd like to ask you both what you think is more sensible, putting the people who are traditional establishment politicians who keep saying the same things over and over but are not working, or putting in someone who might be vile, an outsider, a populist, a radical. Which would make more sense? Are you going to put in the people who say everything is fine when you believe it's not working? And it's not. And here's an important point. The political upheaval didn't take place in 2009. Many people around the world gave the establishment as much time as possible. In fact, I believe it wasn't until the European parliamentary elections in May of 2014 that we saw the first rise of populism expressed widely. So that was 6 years that the establishment had the opportunity to fix things. They didn't. And so I think it makes sense that you start turning to people who are outsiders, radicals, populists, just simply because one party's not even a party. One side is telling you everything's fine, and someone else is saying, no, I think something's wrong.
What I don't understand, though, is what is it that people think needs fixing?
The economy. There's not enough growth.
And when you speak to people back home, what is it that you think caused them to elect somebody that probably in their heart they wish they didn't have to, but still did anyway? What was it that perhaps incentivized them to do that?
Yeah, in my part of the country, it would be very values-based. In a situation where you have one candidate that is not going to look to support that kind of religious or values-based community that they've grown up living in, and then you have one who is going to support your way of life. In that situation, we're talking about pro-guns, we're talking about anti-abortion, social issues that kind of run the right spectrum quite strongly, versus any economic policies when it comes to electing a politician.
I would think that makes sense in an isolated sense, but we are seeing this taking place everywhere. We're seeing it in Brazil, in Argentina, Austria, Italy, Greece, Portugal, Spain, the United Kingdom, Germany. It's happening everywhere. It's spreading. And I think the commonality is that there is a economic depression taking place, a slowdown that's unsatisfactory for 12 years now.
And I guess perhaps one could easily say, well, that sort of slowdown, that undergrowth has been occurring for 12 years, you said. Why not sooner? And perhaps the cause, or one of the necessary conditions for the cause that has occurred to have taken place, was the ability to influence people in ways beyond traditional media means, in the sense that traditional media tends to take a relatively cautious view of statements that are made, and it tends to want to pass those and check that those are right. If you have avenues of expression which aren't going to pass your words and check them for accuracy, you can get away with a lot more.
Yeah, and I think I hate to be the conspiracy theorist in the room on this, but I do think there is a lot of truth to that. In a world where suddenly, and especially in an election year, we used to know when we were being advertised to. We used to watch television, the show would show, and then there'd be a break, and that was commercial. And our brains were able to kind of distinguish what was an ad and what was content.
Yeah.
And that I think manifests itself in the news, too. We have a constant news cycle that's constantly trying to drum up drama and trying to put the radicals on TV and trying to highlight some of those things just because it makes for good TV. But suddenly we're living in a world, and I watched a couple of those documentaries on Netflix about Cambridge Analytica and everything that transpired through that. And at the end of the day, it is just advertising. But I'm just not sure that our brains were aware that we were being advertised to, or that we were receiving propaganda off of a medium, especially social media, where we were traditionally used to just seeing our friends' babies and sharing in a place that we trusted, and we weren't able to necessarily distinguish advertising from content or truth versus lies. And hopefully, as the medium develops, we will get better at that. But those videos or those propaganda, or not propaganda, but advertising, aggressive advertising, I'll say, they're very convincing. They have strong music behind them, and they appeal to your emotions.
Well, with that as one of the best segues we've ever had, what you've been listening to has been fact, and what's following is not necessarily propaganda, but it's certainly advertising.
Miss World Cayman Islands presents Destiny, Saturday, September 7, 2019 at the Harkwell Theater. Cocktail hour starting at 6 p.m. with the pageant starting sharply at 7 p.m. Tickets are on sale now at eventpro.ky.
The Breeze Fusion is back Saturday, November 2nd.
Bigger and better.
Now featuring a 5K walk run and a 10K run for half marathon trainers. Join the fun and help raise funds for the Central Scranton Park and the NCVO. Save the date or register now at CaymanActive.com or at Radio Cayman Studios. Registration is only $15 if registered by September 30th. And all early registrants enter to win a Cayman Airways voucher.
The Breeze Fusion 5K, 10K walk run.
Saturday, November 2nd. This is
Money Sense, bringing an informed financial perspective to the Cayman community. Brought to you by the CFA Society Cayman Islands.
And now, more Money Sense.
Welcome back and a very good morning once again. In the first half of the show, we were discussing the current world disorder, and we mentioned that there's a distinction between facts, evidence, and propaganda, and how people are perhaps more easily persuaded in today's climate. We are now back into the fact and evidence-based part of our show, albeit I think we might be talking some stuff which might get some people's blood pressure boiling. But Emil, before we were talking about some of the stress that's going on in the world, where do we take this now?
Well, I received an email the other day from The Economist, the British magazine, and here is the headline: How Britain's staid Conservative Party became a radical insurgency. Yeah. Now I would say to you that radical insurgencies are exactly what you would expect in this sort of an era. The last time we saw radical insurgencies to this level was the 1930s. But are the Conservatives radical insurgents? Would the Labour Party be radical insurgents? Do the people of Britain want radical insurgents? What is going on with Brexit, Simon? You're from
and start pretty down. I mean, you're standing with some Americans here, but I, for one, have lost track where we are in the British parliamentary procedure.
Well, okay, I will do exactly that, but I will address Emil's question: is the Conservative and Labour Party radical insurgents? I would argue they're just complete incompetence, but that's a personal view. Let's try and go back to the beginning, if we can. Not
1066.
Right. I thought you were going to go back to the formation of the universe, galaxies, and such like. I thought we were going back to our astrophysics class. First of all, I think it's worth asking the question, what exactly do we mean by Brexit? And that might seem a somewhat strange question, given that we seem to be at the end game of it. But in fact, we're at the end game of something that not everybody who's talking about it understood how it began. And that's an important thing. So let's go back in time. Back in, when was it? It seems like a decade ago now, but it wasn't that many years ago. There was a vote, obviously, which happened oddly, in quite a unique circumstance, happened in the United Kingdom and Gibraltar. That doesn't tend to happen for UK elections in quite that way. But this is what happened. We had a vote in the United Kingdom and Gibraltar where the question was, simple question put to people, do you wish to remain a member of the EU or leave the EU? 51.9% of the population who voted said they wished to leave. 48 and a bit said they wanted to leave. 48% wanted to remain. That was on a turnout of 72% of people. So here's a bit of maths for you. The voting eligible population is 46 million. 17 million voted to leave. 16 million voted to remain. There are many, many arguments that have been made over time as to, a massive majority of people voted to leave the EU. Actually, when you do the real numbers, less than not even half of the population who's eligible to vote actually voted for this policy. Now, I'm not suggesting that we should therefore stay, because a fewer number of people voted to remain, but it's worth just having the context. Typically, when you make decisions of this magnitude, governments or countries tend to have some sort of what they call qualified majority voting, whereby not only must you get 50% or 50.1%, but you also must have at least 50% of the population who are eligible to vote doing so, or perhaps you sometimes have 60% of people having to vote for such dramatic change. In the UK, they got slightly over 50 on only 70% turnout. So it was a relatively, it was obviously a positive decision for leave, but it wasn't a ringing endorsement of that policy. And that's important because some of the narrative that happens today is suggesting that if you don't follow through on this policy, you're disenfranchising a majority of the UK population, which of course is not strictly speaking true. So that's the first one. The second one, which is really quite curious, is that the referendum was not legally binding. It was a referendum to express people's opinion. And that's quite odd because in most countries you have a referendum and you say, if you vote this way, this has to happen. That's not the case in the UK. We have a parliamentary democracy, which is a representative democracy, which means that the vote could ever only be indicative. So the vote had to then be ratified by Parliament, who are the representatives of the people. So if Parliament took the vote and said, we don't agree with you, they had the legal right to disagree and go down a different path. So this argument that is often said that, you're disenfranchising the will of the people, that again is not necessarily strictly speaking true, because Parliament has to have the final say, and it was known that the referendum was not legally binding, albeit it's true to say that the government of the day did say that they would abide by the results. Now, bear in mind, of course, the government of the day lasted for almost precisely a year. Then we had a general election, and the government of the day then lost that election and lost their majority. So they rather messed up, shall we say. What were the arguments in favour of leaving the EU, and why were people so passionate about it? And I think it boiled down, frankly, to, I guess, two, maybe three things. One is that they said they wanted to control rules and regulations, that people wanted to control the UK's legal situation. They didn't want to be controlled by foreigners. And the other was that they wanted to regain control of their borders. So they didn't want unfettered access to the UK from immigration, from foreigners. Those are manifestations of populism in writ large, I guess is fair to say.
Do you think that was true necessarily, that those issues were occurring, that they were not being able to control?
Well, that's a
to
fascinating
the extent
question.
that they wanted to.
Those issues were arising, but it's difficult. I may well embarrass my mother here slightly.
I think that's fine.
Yeah, she's on vacation in Italy at the moment, so hopefully she's not listening.
Hopefully not listening.
But she said to me, look, we have too much. She and people of her like sort of used to say, there's too many foreigners in the country, and I find that's a perfectly legitimate argument to have. And I said, well, where are all these foreigners you don't like? And she said, well, they're all over the UK. I said, well, what's your favourite restaurant? She said, well, I love the Italian restaurant, or I love the Chinese restaurant. And actually, when you boil it down, people do like foreigners. They just don't like them when they don't know them. And it's a quite odd and confusing situation.
Right.
Or when wages are not growing fast enough because foreigners are taking lower paying jobs.
Yeah. Well, that's a fair point. But it's fair, totally fair. Now, Brexit, the problem that Brexit had is Ireland. Now, this may seem a curious thing because Ireland technically is not part of the UK, although there were some wars fought in the early parts of the 1900s about that. Britain, as its wont, has an inglorious history with respect to empire building. But the problem with Brexit is that the people who voted or who campaigned to leave said we will be able to regain control of our borders and we'll be able to stop immigration. That meant that we had to leave what's called the customs area or the common market of the EU because that allowed unfettered access between countries. So fine, you leave that. The problem is in the late 90s there was an agreement formed between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland called the Good Friday Agreement. Northern Ireland's part of the UK, the Republic is not. That agreement was formed in order to stop civil war that was taking place in Northern Ireland. And that agreement said there can be no physical borders between the north and the south of Ireland. So you have a situation where the people who campaigned to leave said, we will regain control of our borders, but they knew that they couldn't do that and also honour the intent of the Good Friday Agreement. So one thing you could do is say, we're going to tear that up, rip it up and start again. That leads back to civil war in the north of Ireland, which is obviously unambiguously a bad thing. The problem is, as I said, that the UK government called an election and they lost that election. And one way you can solve the Northern Ireland problem is to impose, instead of having customs borders between the Republic and Northern Ireland, you could have freedom of movement within Ireland and then a sort of customs border across the Irish Sea so that goods flowing from Ireland get stopped and have to be taxed at that level. Problem is, the UK government was propped up by a party called the Democratic Unionist Party, which is vehemently anti anything to do with the Republic of Ireland. And they said, under no conditions could we allow that. We'd much rather have a border between the Republic and the South and the North. So, in essence, this whole Brexit conversation has been held hostage by a small group, a small group of Northern Irish politicians who are reluctant to allow a democratic process to happen in Ireland and allow the people to actually fairly express their views. And frankly, it's almost impossible to conceive of a scenario where those two things can happen, can be resolved. And that's a real problem. And so the Brexit conversation you see today is almost unsolvable. It's unsolvable until someone compromises what they believe to be a fundamental emotional perspective. And it's difficult to compromise on those things.
So how many more years are we going to be delaying and turning over the government and calling for snap elections?
Well, the good thing is that question will take far too long to answer, and we're running out of time. So I don't have to answer that question, fortunately. But the answer is the simple answer is it's unless we see Boris Johnson wants to call an election. Ironically, the opposition don't want to have an election, which is the first time the government wants to pull itself out of power and the opposition wants to keep it in power. That's a very odd situation. But he wants an election so he can bring in this populism and make things happen and then override the will of all these other people who have these emotional concerns. I don't know how that's solved. It's a very difficult endgame. We are, however, running out of time, and perhaps we can continue this in a couple of weeks' time when we know a little bit clearer as to what's going on in the UK. We can continue this conversation.
I doubt it.
But I know, yes, I know that we do have 20 seconds from you, Amy, on our upcoming conference. So let you get to that, and then we'll close the show.
Yes, the CFA, the CFA Society Cayman Islands will be hosting the 7th annual Cayman Investment Forum at the Ritz-Carlton on October 17th. You can go to www.caymaninvestmentforum.com to register and learn more about our wonderful speakers. Our theme this year is going to be human decision making. We have psychologists. We have people that are very good at forensic accounting, and we have Andy Fastow, the ex-CFO of Enron, fresh out of prison, to share his perspectives. It actually, I think, will be a very interesting conversation. And any listener of Money Sense can get a 10% discount by using the discount code MoneySense. One word, all caps.
Well, that seems straightforward. So straightforward, I'm sure even I could remember and figure that out. That is it. We are slightly over time, and our producer is giving a glare to me. So I do apologise to her. Thank you very much to all our listeners for joining us, and rejoin us again in 2 weeks' time as we will perhaps continue the debate about what's going on in the world, Brexit and all such other things. Enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you for joining us.